I was going to look up the definition of pioneers, since the title of this is Pioneers in AA, and I forgot to do that in my rushing around my life. But my mental definition of pioneers is somebody who lives on the edge of the frontier and brings the qualities that Bob talked about, love and caring about each other, into new territory, and develops those kinds of struggles. And the people on this panel are part of those pioneers who have brought the struggle of our fellowship's early years. The next one has brought, Travers C. has brought our struggles through our growth in England. So let's hear from Travers.
Your convention. I'd like to bring greetings from the Little Newcomers group in Bristol, and I'm sure quite a lot of other people in England. Frank said I have 15 minutes in which to speak. You know, the first mind races and says, now what the hell can I cut out? But then last night I did a sensible thing. I sat down with a pen and a piece of paper, and I wrote down all the things that I can do in 15 minutes. And I came up with some rather strange answers, but I'm sure you wouldn't want me to make an exhibition of myself at this meeting this afternoon. Can I please ask all the alcoholics in this room to stand up? Thank you very much. You may sit down now. I just wanted to identify you because I expect you've been wondering why I've had you all brought here. And the only good reason I can think of at the moment is to say that I understand nothing about being a pioneer. I really and truly do not understand. I, like Frank, stayed away from looking it up. As far as I'm concerned, being a pioneer is somebody who doesn't make a very good success of things. They try, but they fail. I remember the early people who tried to fly in aeroplanes. They were pioneers. Most of them crashed. I remember the people who tried to go underwater in submarines. They were pioneers, and most of them drowned. And then I can bring it back into terms that we understand, and I think EBT was a pioneer. And judging by the recovery that's around today, the lasting, long-term, full recovery with quality, Ebby didn't make too much of a success of it. Now, I know that usually I find that if I am a pioneer, it usually means that somewhere along the line I make people as mad as hell. And that's always a pain to me. I don't want to make people mad as hell, but I want to look over that frontier. I want to see what is possible. And I then want to find out what is even more probable, a horizon that can be attained. Whether that fits the answer of what is a pioneer, I don't really know. I want to say something in response to something that's already been said by Sue here this afternoon. And I want to make this observation as somebody who does not live in your country, who visits it frequently. Sue said something about there were two co-founders, Bill and Bob. And the observation I want to make is based on my attendance at many, many Founders' Days in Akron. And I have noticed, as is common throughout the world, devotion is held to this saint and to that saint, and it's rather strange that if you go to Russia, the Catholics in Russia hold great devotion to St. Martin de Porres, who was a black saint from South America. And if you go to South America, probably one of the most important saints down there is St. Patrick from Ireland. But I have noticed in this country that it is the Hispanics and the blacks who seem to identify more closely with Dr. Bob than they do with Bill. Now, that is an entirely personal observation, but I think it's worth one considering. Perhaps there is something in the makeup of Dr. Bob that those two cultures seem to understand. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I said I was an alcoholic. I was born Jewish. I want to tell you about my first relationship with alcohol. It was at the age of 14. I was at a social occasion. I was offered a glass of alcohol. I drank from it. I was halfway down the glass and I was looking for the second. Now, I have to consider why I was looking for the second, and it's fairly obvious. It was that I felt much better. Somebody might ask, better than what? And I will tell you, better than what I was. Well, what was I before I took that first drink? I was 14 years of age. I was about to enter that very special time of a man's life known as adolescence, when he has 3 left feet and doesn't know what to do with his hands. I had an appalling stutter. I am cross-eyed, and I was Jewish, which wasn't a very healthy thing to be in the early 30s in England. So you can see I didn't have a lot going for me. And just that one initial contact, and I was on my way. And I'm just going to come to the very latter stages of my drinking. I was in 32 different mental asylums. I had 9 shots of ECT, and it was in 1955 that somebody came to see me when I was unreceptive and drunk. I went to a few meetings of AA, and I thought it really was a wonderful thing, but for those fellows there, but not for me. And eventually I made it back in 1959, since when I have not taken alcohol. And at the end of a 10.5-month spell in one of those locked wards on a mental hospital, I was released onto the great wide open world. There was one struggling group of Alcoholics Anonymous in a major city which I had to join. Now, here's where the pioneer bit comes in, I think. During my 10.5 months in that hospital, I had managed to get hold of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. I had devoured it. I had tried to put it into practice, and by God, I believed in it. I came out, and in this group and the other groups I could find in England at that time, there was no big book, there was no program, there was no literature. There was a message, very simply, of stay away from one drink one day. Join our little fellowship of slippers and slippies. And I didn't believe that, because I had immersed myself into that big book. So I found myself immediately at odds with what pertained to be Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I think it's taken me 32 years to think this thing through, but I believe there is a reason for that, and I believe it's sexual. Now, you've got to think that AA started, and the first emergence of it was in 1947. And in 1947, we were just out of the Second World War, in which we had a very famous catchphrase about the Americans. Overpaid, over here, and oversexed. And I really do believe, and I am serious, that that was part of the reason, the surfeit we had had of American GIs among our men who resented them very, very strongly, because they did form certain liaisons with our charming girlfriends. And that was one of the stumbling blocks to anything American at that time. I'm very happy to say that things have progressed since then. I've been fortunate in sponsorship. I have tried to pioneer with sponsorship. I got a lot of things put upon me by sponsorship that I didn't want to do, but I did it. One of the things in the early 60s was training for the field of alcoholism. I didn't want to do that, but I did it. I didn't want to set up councils on alcoholism, but I did it. I didn't want to set up treatment facilities, but I did it. And certainly in 1968, I didn't want to start a journal called Bristol Fashion, but I did it. And all that has been part of the non-joy at times benefits of being a pioneer. I was very fortunate, I believe, perhaps a little joy and relief in being a pioneer in 1972 when the Roman Catholic Church in Rome wanted to acknowledge the work of Alcoholics Anonymous. 2 of us were chosen, Sackville of Dublin and myself, to go to Dublin to receive the Order of the Good Shepherd, which now resides with Frank in New York at Archives. Now that is one of the lighter sides of being a pioneer as far as I am concerned. I want to make a plea today, and my plea would be this, that everyone in this room who believes in Alcoholics Anonymous, who has got some grasp of our program and some recovery, will consider going out from here and seeing how they can become pioneers. I believe there is more pioneering, as I understand it, to be done today, really, than there was by Dr. Bob and Bill, because they really only had to assimilate and to develop a program. We have got a much bigger job. We've got to keep that program and hold it together for those to come. I don't really want to say much more. I would just like to say one or two little things that probably are very personal to me. And I know there are a few people in this room who know the man I'm going to talk about. He was the founder, and therefore a pioneer, in my opinion, of Alcoholics Anonymous in Europe. He was the man who had faith enough to sell up his business and go across to Europe with some big books and try and set up that first group in 1946. He lives now in Philadelphia. He is very old, and he is not well at the moment. I spoke to his wife a few days ago, and she was telling me about him. She said, now try to help stimulate him, because mention old names, old things that happened, and try and get his brain moving, because he has now Alzheimer's. And so, of course, I spoke to him, and we chatted away for about 20 minutes. And then he said something that made me absolutely certain that God is still with him and in his life. He just said this. I said, almost at the end of the call now, come on, Connor, tell me, how are you really today? And he said, well, Travers, he said, I'm not too good, really. He said, I've got something wrong with me. And he said, but it's all right, it's nothing really to worry about. He said, I listened to the doctor speaking to Margaret, and he told her that I had old-timer's disease. I just surged with faith that God is still there for these early people. I want to tell you 3 things that have been helpful to me. One was about 12 years ago. I had a friend. She was 28 years of age. She had 3 young children. And she had just been given a 6 months medical sentence. She was going to die in 6 months' time. But she was the kind of person you could talk to about that sort of thing. I said, now that you're going to die, is there anything in your life you would have changed? And she said, yes, Travers. 3 things. I would have played with my children more often. I would have loved more often. And I would have prayed more often. Right at the end, when she had her back against the wall, I think she knew about the priorities of living. And another thing was, about 3 years after I stopped drinking, I was out walking in the north of England on Hadrian's Wall between England and Scotland, and I came up above a little hamlet and saw a little church, and I'm a great man for gravestones and epitaphs. And I suddenly saw an epitaph there that has been with me every day since, nearly 30 years. I was having a little difficulty with my own personal acceptance of me, Travers. And I looked on this gravestone, and it was an epitaph to a hunchbacked priest dated 1632. And the epitaph said just this: "Beneath this yew, in the shadow of a shade, a little humble singing priest is laid. He loved his life, of death was not afraid, and loved his Maker, though so strangely made." And I think that settled my acceptance for all time, because I could see myself as being strangely made. Being an alcoholic and having found this recovery has led me personally to an entirely satisfactory spiritual life. In case you're in any doubt, to me a spiritual life means a life which befits a human being. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks very much, Travers.